Now, Sydney residents have woken up to another day of thick smoke haze, and experts say the air quality across the city is currently one of the worst in the world. These satellite pictures from NASA's Earth observing system show a thick blanket over the city. And with more than 100 fires still burning across the state, the most severe forming into a mega blaze north of Sydney, there's little hope for any end in sight. So how worried do we need to be about inhaling all of this smoke? To answer that question, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Broome, who's the New South Wales Health Director of Environmental Health. Thanks for joining me, Richard.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks for having me on.
How bad is it for people to be outside in the smoke right now?
Look, for most people, even in this thick smoke, it's not going to cause a great deal more than sore eyes, nose and throat, perhaps a bit of a cough. But it can be hazardous for some people. And mainly that's people who have existing heart or lung conditions, things like asthma or emphysema, or heart conditions like angina. And so it is really important, if you have one of those conditions, that you're alert to the conditions, to the smoke conditions, and you take steps to avoid exposure.
Who is most at risk? And you know, we keep hearing different equivalents. You know, it's like smoking X number of cigarettes. Is that really the case?
So the smoke contains very fine particles that when you breathe them in, they get deep into your lungs and where they cause irritation. And for most people, that doesn't cause many problems. But if you do have an existing condition, a heart or a lung condition, it can actually have quite severe consequences by making that condition worse. So I've heard the comparisons about smoking and things like that. Look, there's enough differences between smoking and outdoor air pollution, I think, to make those sorts of comparisons difficult. But certainly we know that the types of air pollution levels that we've been seeing in Sydney for the last few days are hazardous for some people.
If you are among those who are in that risk category and suffer from asthma or any of the other illnesses you've mentioned, you know, should we be staying indoors?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that people should be thinking about. The first thing is to avoid exposure as much as possible, and the best way to do that is to stay indoors. It's also really important when you are out and about to try and minimise your exertion, so avoiding outdoor physical activity is also important. The other thing is, if you do have an existing heart or lung condition, it's really important to be managing your symptoms effectively at the moment. So if you are finding that your symptoms are uncontrolled, it's a good idea to go and see your GP to see if there's anything you can do about that.
Just generally speaking, I mean, we don't know how long this is going to last for. You know, it's been on and off, this thick haze for several weeks now. It's almost unprecedented. Do you think that if you are in that risk category, people should be thinking about you know, leaving the state, going interstate for a holiday, or even just, you know, to work remotely?
I think it's important to keep these in perspective, and as I said before, the risks for most people are extremely small. You know, you're not going to suffer much more than sore eyes, nose and throats, and even for people who have existing conditions, the risks are still relatively small. You know, there's an increased chance that you might get an asthma attack or problems with your heart, for example, but it's still a small risk in the greater scheme of things. So what I would say is, even when it's smoky, there are still plenty of things that you can do while staying where you live. So, for example, just staying indoors, keeping the doors and windows shut, actually protects you very well from the smoke. If you are finding, though, after a few days that smoke's getting into your house, there are other places, so libraries, shopping centres, air-conditioned buildings also provide protection. So there's a whole range of things you can do without having to take extreme measures at this stage.
Is there a certain point that this gets to when this is classified as a genuine health emergency?
Look, and again, I think it is important to keep this in perspective, and the longer the smoke continues, I think that the fact is that it does increase the risk slightly for people who have these pre-existing conditions, but it still remains, you know, a relatively small risk in the greater scheme of things. So it is important to remember that the smoke can be hazardous and to take sensible actions to reduce exposure. And those, as I said, is staying indoors as much as possible when it is smoky, avoiding outdoor physical activity, and if you do have an existing condition like asthma, just making sure you're keeping on top of that. So, for example, if you do have asthma, if you're prescribed a preventer puffer, it's a really good idea to be taking that at the moment. If you've got a reliever as well, you should be carrying that with you when you're out and about. The other thing is that even when it is smoky, there's often periods of time in the day when the smoke lifts for a while, and people should take those opportunities to go outside and do their exercise, or to air out their house as well. That's another important thing to think about.
Richard, really appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you.